Have you ever walked past someone in need and told yourself someone else would help? Now imagine a freezing winter night, a little girl in danger, and dozens of people too busy to care. That's exactly what happened outside the Grandview Plaza in Chicago when 7-year-old Sophie Whitmore slipped on black ice and tumbled toward oncoming traffic. 50 people walked by in expensive coats with their eyes straight ahead. But one man, the one everyone had been avoiding all evening, dropped everything and ran. What happened next exposed the cruelty of the wealthy, the courage of the forgotten, and a truth about humanity that nobody in that crowd was ready to face. Pay close attention, because the story will make you question everything you think you know about worth, dignity, and what it really means to be rich. The snow had been falling over Chicago for 3 days straight, transforming the city into a postcard-perfect winter wonderland that looked beautiful in photographs but created treacherous conditions for anyone actually trying to navigate the streets. Ice formed in sheets across sidewalks, invisible and deadly. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that burned your lungs when you breathed and turned your fingers numb in minutes. Outside the Grandview Plaza, one of Chicago's most exclusive shopping destinations, the contrast between wealth and poverty had never been more stark. Through the massive glass doors, the interior glowed with warm golden light. Christmas decorations sparkled from every surface. A 20-foot tree covered in designer ornaments, garlands wrapped in silk ribbon, window displays featuring jewelry that cost more than most people's annual salary. People streamed in and out of those doors carrying bags from Gucci, Prada, Cartier, Tiffany. Women in fur coats and designer boots. Men in expensive overcoats, leather gloves, cashmere scarves. All of them moving quickly, heads down against the wind, focused on getting from their heated cars to the heated mall and back again with minimal exposure to the cold. 30 feet from the entrance, pressed against the brick wall of the building, sat Marcus Webb. Marcus was 46 years old, though the streets had aged him in ways that made him look closer to 60. His face was weathered and lined, his dark skin ashen from the cold and malnutrition. He wore layers of clothing, everything he owned piled on his body in a desperate attempt to stay warm. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 shirts, 2 jackets, and a coat that had been donated to a shelter with a broken zipper that he'd tried to fix with a safety pin. His hands were wrapped in fingerless gloves he'd made by cutting the ends off a pair of socks. His feet were in boots that were 2 sizes too big, stuffed with newspaper for insulation, covered in duct tape to keep the soles from flapping. A wool beanie that had once been red but was now an indeterminate brownish color covered his head. Next to him sat a cardboard sign, the words written in careful block letters with a Sharpie he'd found in a trash can. Homeless vet. Hungry. Anything helps. God bless. Marcus had been sitting there since noon, 7 hours now, and he'd collected exactly $8.37. Enough for a hot meal at the shelter if he could get there before they stopped serving. Not enough for a motel room, which would have cost at least $40 for the cheapest, most dangerous places. He'd been homeless for 2 years, ever since he lost his job as a maintenance worker at a factory that closed down, moved production overseas. He'd lost his apartment 3 months after that, when his savings ran out and he couldn't make rent. He'd spent time in shelters, but they were always full this time of year, and the waiting list stretched for weeks. Marcus was a veteran, had served in the Marines for 6 years, including 2 tours in Iraq. He had honorable discharge papers folded in a plastic bag in his pocket, along with his expired ID, a photo of his daughter from 20 years ago when she was still speaking to him, and a medal for marksmanship he'd won in boot camp. But none of that mattered to the people streaming past him. To them, he was invisible. Or worse than invisible, he was something to avoid, something that made them uncomfortable, a reminder of how close any of them might be to the same fate if their luck ran out. Marcus had learned not to make eye contact. That scared people. He'd learned not to speak unless spoken to. He'd learned to make himself as small and non-threatening as possible, to blend into the wall, to be grateful for whatever anyone chose to give him and never, ever complain or ask for more. He watched the shoppers come and go, most of them not even glancing in his direction. A few looked at him with pity. More looked at him with disgust. One woman had pulled her child away when the boy tried to give Marcus $1, hissing, "Don't touch that man, Tyler." We don't know where he's been, but Marcus stayed because this was one of the better spots. The awning provided some shelter from the snow. The wall retained a tiny bit of heat from the building, and enough people came through that if even 1% of them gave something, he could survive another day. The doors opened again, releasing a blast of warm air and Christmas music. Marcus's eyes tracked the movement automatically, assessing a family, wealthy based on the clothing and the shopping bags, father, mother, and a little girl. The father was tall and imposing, probably in his early 40s, with a kind of polished appearance that came from expensive haircuts and tailored clothes. He wore a long black wool coat that probably cost $2,000, leather gloves, and a red scarf. His face was angular and stern, the kind of face used to being obeyed. The mother was beautiful in that carefully maintained way that required personal trainers, expensive skincare, and probably some cosmetic work. She wore a cream-colored coat with a fur collar, designer boots with heels that were completely impractical for icy sidewalks, and carried multiple shopping bags from stores Marcus had never even been inside. And then there was the little girl. She was about 7 years old, with long blonde hair spilling out from under a pink knit hat with a pom-pom on top. Her coat was purple and puffy, the kind designed more for fashion than function, and she wore white boots that matched her white gloves. She was carrying a small shopping bag of her own and chattering excitedly to her parents about something Marcus couldn't quite hear. The mother, whose name was Catherine Whitmore, was scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention. "Sophie, darling, we need to hurry. Your piano teacher will be here in 30 minutes and you still need to practice. But Mom, I want to show Daddy what we got." Sophie protested, trying to open her bag while walking. "Not now, sweetheart," her father, Richard Whitmore, said absently. He was also on his phone, typing rapidly. "I have a conference call in 20 minutes. We need to get home." They were walking quickly, their expensive shoes clicking on the pavement. None of them were looking where they were going, all of them distracted by phones or shopping bags or their own thoughts. And none of them saw the black ice. It happened in slow motion, the way all accidents seem to when you're watching them unfold. Sophie's white boot hit the invisible sheet of ice that had formed over a slight depression in the sidewalk. Her foot shot forward, her arms windmilled, the shopping bag flying from her hand. She let out a small cry of surprise. Her mother looked up from her phone a second too late. Sophie, the little girl, went down hard, landing on her side, and then the momentum carried her forward. She started sliding, spinning slightly, heading directly toward the curb and the street beyond, where cars were moving slowly but steadily through the snow. Catherine screamed. Richard lunged forward but slipped himself, going down on one knee. Other pedestrians nearby froze, their faces registering shock but their bodies not moving, that terrible moment of paralysis when the brain can't decide whether to act or flee. Sophie was sliding faster now, her coat providing almost no friction against the ice. She was crying, terrified, trying to grab onto something but finding nothing. The curb was 5 feet away, then 3 feet, then 1. Marcus didn't think. Thinking would have reminded him that his body was stiff from cold, that he hadn't eaten a full meal in days, that his boots were held together with duct tape and might not give him the traction he needed. Thinking would have reminded him that these were the kind of people who looked through him like he was invisible, who probably thought he deserved to be homeless, who wouldn't cross the street to help him if their situations were reversed. But Marcus had been a Marine. And Marines ran toward danger, not away from it. He launched himself forward, his body moving on instinct and training that was 25 years old but still embedded in his muscles. His boots slipped on the ice, but he compensated, lowering his center of gravity, using his arms for balance. 3 strides and he was at the curb just as Sophie's body reached it. Marcus dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain of impact on the frozen concrete, and wrapped his arms around the little girl just as her head was about to strike the curb. He twisted his body, taking the impact himself, his shoulder slamming into the metal pole of a parking meter with a crack that made several onlookers wince. Sophie was safe in his arms, crying but unhurt. Marcus held her for just a moment, making sure she was okay, then gently set her down away from the curb and the street. "You're okay," he said softly, his voice rough from disuse and the cold. "You're safe now." Sophie looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. She was probably terrified, Marcus thought. A homeless man had grabbed her. Her parents had probably taught her to stay away from people like him. But instead of screaming or pulling away, Sophie threw her arms around his neck and hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she sobbed into his shoulder. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Marcus froze, shocked. When was the last time someone had hugged him? Years, actual years. The warmth of this small child clinging to him, trusting him, grateful to him, it broke something open in his chest that he'd locked away a long time ago. "It's okay, little one," he said, his voice cracking. "You're okay now." Sophie, Catherine had finally reached them, her face pale with terror and her expensive boots slipping with every step. She grabbed Sophie and pulled her away from Marcus like he was contaminated. "Don't touch her. Get away from my daughter." Marcus immediately raised his hands and backed away, standing up slowly so as not to seem threatening. "Ma'am, I wasn't." She was sliding into traffic. I said get away." Catherine shrieked, clutching Sophie to her chest. Richard! This man grabbed Sophie. Richard had finally managed to get to his feet and was limping over, his knee bleeding through his expensive pants from his fall. His face was dark with anger. "You touched my daughter, sir?" "I was helping," Marcus started to explain. "Helping?" Richard's voice was loud enough that people all around had stopped to watch. "You grabbed a little girl? A 7-year-old child?" "Dad, no." Sophie was trying to explain, her small voice lost in her mother's grip. "He saved me." "I was going to be quiet," Sophie, Catherine commanded, her voice sharp. She looked at Marcus with pure revulsion. "I know what you people do. I know you target wealthy families, pretend to help, and then try to extort money or sue us." "Well, it's not going to work." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. "Ma'am, I don't want anything. Your daughter was in danger. That's all. That's all." Richard stepped forward aggressively, and Marcus had to fight the instinct to stand his ground. Instead, he took another step back, making himself smaller, less threatening. "You put your filthy hands on my child. You could have hurt her. You could have." "He saved her." The voice came from the crowd that had gathered. An older woman, maybe in her 60s, wearing a practical coat and sensible boots, pushed forward. I saw the whole thing. Your daughter slipped on the ice and was sliding into traffic. That man," she pointed at Marcus, "ran and caught her before she went into the street. He probably saved her life." "That's what I've been trying to tell you," Sophie cried, tears streaming down her face. "Mommy, he saved me. I was so scared and he caught me and Sophie." "Hush," Catherine said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. She looked at her husband, who was staring at Marcus with a mixture of anger and confusion. "Is that true?" Richard asked the older woman. "He saved her?" "Yes," the woman said firmly. "I saw it. She was sliding fast, heading right for the curb and the street. Cars were coming. If he hadn't grabbed her, she would have." She didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. The crowd murmured in agreement. Several other people confirmed the woman's account. A man in a business suit held up his phone. "I got it on video. Want me to send it to you?" Catherine's face had gone from pale to flushed. She looked down at Sophie, really looked at her for the first time, seeing the tear tracks on her daughter's face and the terror in her eyes at almost being hit by a car. She looked at Marcus, standing there with his hands still raised, his shoulder clearly injured from the impact, making himself as non-threatening as possible. Catherine started, then stopped. You thought a homeless man couldn't possibly be helping," the older woman said bluntly. "You thought he must be doing something wrong because people like him are always doing something wrong. Isn't that right?" The accusation hung in the air. Other people in the crowd were nodding. Marcus could see the judgment in their faces, but for once it wasn't directed at him. Richard had the grace to look ashamed. "I apologize," he said stiffly to Marcus. "I misunderstood the situation. Thank you for helping our daughter." It was the bare minimum of acknowledgement, delivered with all the warmth of a corporate press release. But Catherine said nothing. She just held Sophie tighter and stared at Marcus like she still wasn't quite convinced he wasn't a threat. "It's fine," Marcus said quietly, even though it wasn't fine, even though his shoulder throbbed and his heart ached and he'd just been accused of trying to hurt a child when all he'd done was save her life. "I'm just glad she's okay." He turned to walk back to his spot against the wall, but Sophie pulled away from her mother and ran to him. Before Catherine could stop her, she grabbed Marcus's hand. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him with absolute sincerity. "You're a hero. My real hero." Marcus felt tears prick his eyes. "You're welcome, little one. Be careful on the ice, okay?" Sophie nodded seriously. Then she did something that made the entire crowd gasp. She took off her pink hat, the expensive designer hat that probably cost more than Marcus made in a week of sitting on that sidewalk, and held it out to him. "Your head is cold," she said simply. "You should have this, Sophie." "No," Catherine started. But Sophie wasn't paying attention to her mother. She was looking at Marcus with a child's pure, uncomplicated generosity. "Please take it. You saved me. You should have something nice." Marcus looked at that pink hat with its ridiculous pom-pom, completely inappropriate for a middle-aged homeless man, and felt something break inside him. He knelt down carefully because his shoulder hurt and met Sophie's eyes. "That's the nicest thing anyone's offered me in a long time," he said, his voice thick. "But I can't take your hat. Your mom bought that for you, but you're cold," Sophie insisted. "Aren't you cold?" "I am," Marcus admitted, "but I'll be okay." "You keep your hat and stay warm, all right?" Sophie looked like she wanted to argue, but Richard had come over and put his hand on her shoulder. "Sophie, we need to go." Now, as they walked away, Sophie kept turning back to look at Marcus, waving each time until her parents finally got her into their Mercedes SUV parked at the curb. The crowd dispersed, the drama over, everyone moving on with their lives. Marcus walked slowly back to his spot against the wall. His shoulder was definitely injured. He could barely lift his arm. His hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him exhausted and aching. He sat down heavily, leaning against the brick wall, and closed his eyes. In his mind, he kept seeing Catherine's face, the disgust and fear and assumption that he must be doing something wrong. The way she'd pulled Sophie away from him like he was diseased. The way Richard had accused him of targeting their family. It wasn't new. Marcus had experienced that kind of prejudice hundreds of times since becoming homeless. People assumed he was dangerous, or crazy, or a drug addict, or all three. They assumed he'd made bad choices, that he deserved his situation, that he was somehow morally inferior to them. But it still hurt. Every single time it hurt. "Excuse me." Marcus opened his eyes. A young woman stood in front of him, maybe in her 20s, wearing a modest coat and carrying a coffee from the Starbucks inside the mall. She held it out to him. "I saw what happened," she said softly. "What you did for that little girl. That was really brave. I thought you might want something warm to drink." Marcus took the coffee with trembling hands. "Thank you. Thank you so much." "No," the woman said. "Thank you for being the kind of person who runs toward danger to help someone else. We need more people like you in the world." She walked away before Marcus could respond, disappearing into the crowd. He wrapped his hands around the warm cup and brought it to his face, breathing in the steam, letting it warm his frozen skin. Other people started approaching. A businessman gave him a $20 bill. A teenager gave him a sandwich she'd just bought. An elderly couple stopped to ask if he needed medical attention for his shoulder and, when he said he was fine, insisted on at least giving him a gift card to Walgreens so he could buy pain medication. By the time the crowd had moved on, Marcus had more money than he'd collected in the last week combined, plus food, the coffee, and genuine expressions of gratitude and respect that made him feel, for the first time in years, like a human being instead of an invisible problem. But the most surprising part came 30 minutes later. Marcus had finished the coffee and was trying to figure out if his shoulder was just bruised or actually damaged when a black Mercedes SUV pulled up to the curb. The back door opened and Sophie jumped out, followed more slowly by her parents. Sophie ran straight to Marcus, who struggled to stand up. Richard and Catherine followed behind, both of them looking deeply uncomfortable. "We came back," Sophie announced, "because I told Mommy and Daddy what really happened and that they were mean to you and that we had to come back and say sorry properly." "Sophie," Catherine said, her voice tight with some emotion Marcus couldn't identify. "Let me talk, please." She took a breath and looked directly at Marcus for the first time since the incident. "Mr. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, Marcus." "Marcus Webb, Mr. Webb," Catherine said, and Marcus could see what it cost her to speak to him with actual respect. "I owe you an apology, a real one. When I saw you holding Sophie, I panicked. I saw," she paused, struggling with the words. "I saw what I expected to see based on my own prejudices, and I was wrong. You saved my daughter's life, and I accused you of trying to hurt her. That was inexcusable." It was a real apology, Marcus realized with surprise. Not the corporate non-apology he'd expected. An actual acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Richard stepped forward. "Mr. Webb, I also apologize. Sophie has informed me that I was really rude to her hero, and she's right. You acted with courage and selflessness, and I responded with suspicion and judgment. I'm sorry." Sophie was nodding vigorously. "And we brought you something." Catherine reached into her designer handbag and pulled out an envelope. She held it out to Marcus, who took it hesitantly. "What's this?" "Open it," Sophie urged. Inside was a check for $10,000. Marcus stared at it, certain he was misreading the amount. But no, it clearly said $10,100. "We can't pay you for saving Sophie's life," Richard said. "Nothing could repay that debt. But we wanted to do something to show our gratitude and to help you get back on your feet." Marcus looked at the check, then at the family standing in front of him. This is too much. I wasn't expecting anything. I just did what anyone would do, but not everyone did do it." The older woman's voice came from behind them. She'd apparently followed the family back. "I was standing right there, and I watched at least 50 people walk by that little girl sliding toward traffic. You were the only one who ran to help." "That says something about your character, sir," Catherine nodded. "We also wanted to offer you something else." She pulled out a business card. "My husband owns Whitmore Industries. We have several entry-level positions available: maintenance, warehouse work, security. If you're interested, this card has the contact information for our HR director. I've already called and told her to expect your call. The job is yours if you want it." Marcus felt lightheaded. A check for $10,000 and a job offer. After 2 years of sleeping in shelters and scraping by, suddenly his life could change completely. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "Say you'll take it," Sophie piped up. "Say you'll use the money to get a house and take the job so you don't have to sit in the cold anymore." Marcus looked down at this small girl who'd been so kind to him, so pure in her gratitude and generosity. He knelt down again, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. "Thank you, Sophie. You have a good heart. Don't ever let the world take that away from you, okay?" Sophie hugged him again, and this time Catherine didn't pull her away. In fact, Catherine was crying, mascara running down her carefully made-up face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for how I treated you. My daughter is braver and kinder than I am, and I'm ashamed of that." "Maybe," Marcus said gently, "but you came back. You apologized. You're trying to make it right. That takes courage too." They talked for a few more minutes, Richard giving Marcus his personal phone number and making him promise to call the next day about the job. Catherine gave him the name of an extended stay hotel where they'd already reserved and paid for a room for the next month. "Get some rest," she said. "Get warm. And please, call that number tomorrow. We'd like to help however we can." As they drove away, Sophie waving frantically through the back window until the car turned the corner. Marcus stood on that icy sidewalk holding a check that represented more money than he'd had in his hands in 5 years and a business card that represented a future he'd stopped believing was possible. The older woman was still standing nearby. "You're famous, you know," she said with a smile. "That video of you saving Sophie has over 1 million views. People are calling you a hero." Marcus shook his head. "I'm not a hero. I just did what needed to be done. That's what heroes say," the woman replied. "My name is Dorothy, by the way. Dorothy Chen. I'm a reporter for the Chicago Tribune. Would you be willing to talk to me about your story? Not just today, your whole story. How you became homeless, what it's like, how people treat you. I think it's a story people need to hear." Marcus hesitated. He'd spent 2 years trying to be invisible, and now suddenly everyone wanted to see him. It was overwhelming and frightening and oddly wonderful all at once. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll tell you my story, but on one condition." "What's that?" "Make sure people know that there are thousands of homeless veterans just like me. People who served their country and then fell through the cracks. People who aren't bad or dangerous or lazy, just people who hit hard times and couldn't find their way back. If my story can help change how people see them, then it's worth telling. Dorothy smiled. Deal. Come on. Let me buy you dinner, and you can tell me everything. That night, Marcus slept in a real bed for the first time in 2 years. The hotel room the Whitmores had paid for was simple but clean, with heat that worked and hot water and a door that locked. He took a shower that lasted 40 minutes, standing under the hot water until his fingers pruned, washing away months of street grime and shame. He looked at himself in the mirror afterward, really looked at himself for the first time in a long time. He was thinner than he'd been before homelessness, his face more lined, his eyes more weary. But he was still Marcus Webb, still the Marine who'd served his country, still the man who'd raised a daughter even if she didn't talk to him anymore. Still someone with value and dignity and worth. The next morning, Marcus called the number on the business card. The HR director, a kind woman named Patricia, told him to come in that afternoon for a preliminary interview. She assured him that the job was his if he wanted it, but they needed to go through the normal process for legal reasons. Mr. Whitmore also wanted me to tell you, Patricia said, that we have several programs for employees experiencing housing insecurity. Once you're hired, we can connect you with resources for permanent housing, professional clothing, healthcare, whatever you need to get stable. Marcus thanked her, his voice breaking, and said he'd be there at 2 p.m. He used some of the money from his few weeks of panhandling to buy new clothes from a thrift store, clean pants, a button-up shirt, a jacket that didn't have any visible holes or stains. He didn't cash the $10,000 check yet. That money was for later, for security, for building a real life. But he needed to do this right, needed to prove he could work and earn his place. The interview went well. Patricia was professional and kind, and she didn't ask invasive questions about his homelessness. She focused on his work history, his skills, his military service. By the end of the hour, Marcus had a job starting Monday as a maintenance technician at one of Whitmore Industries' warehouses. The pay was $15 an hour, not a fortune, but enough to live on, enough to rebuild. On his way out of the building, Marcus ran into Richard Whitmore in the lobby. Mr. Webb, Richard said, extending his hand. I'm glad you came. Patricia tells me you'll be starting Monday. Yes, sir. Thank you again for this opportunity. Richard shook his head. I should be thanking you. Sophie hasn't stopped talking about her hero Marcus. She's writing a story about you for school. And Catherine, he paused, looking uncomfortable. My wife has been doing a lot of soul searching since yesterday. She grew up with money, and I think she's realized she's been insulated from understanding how most people live. She's asked me to look into our company's charitable giving and see if we're doing enough to help homeless veterans. That's good, Marcus said. There are a lot of men and women out there who served their country and just need a chance to get back on their feet. My father was a veteran, Richard said quietly. Korea, he never talked much about it, but I know it affected him. If he'd been in your position, I'd like to think someone would have helped him. Dorothy Chen's article ran in the Chicago Tribune 3 days later, on the front page. The hero we didn't see, how a homeless veteran saved a life while society looked away, was accompanied by a large photo of Marcus cleaned up now, wearing clothes from his new job, but still clearly showing the wear of his years on the street. The article told Marcus's story. His service in the Marines, his honorable discharge, his years working as a maintenance worker, his daughter who lived in California and hadn't spoken to him since he became homeless, the factory closing that cost him his job, the spiral into homelessness. It described in detail what it was like to be invisible on the streets, to have people avoid your eyes, to be treated as less than human. But the heart of the article was the incident with Sophie. Dorothy had interviewed several witnesses, including the businessman who'd recorded the video. She'd even interviewed Catherine and Richard, who spoke candidly about their initial reaction and their shame at having misjudged Marcus so completely. "I thought I was a good person," Catherine was quoted as saying. "I donate to charity. I volunteer at my daughter's school. But when I saw a homeless man holding my child, I immediately assumed the worst. I didn't see a hero, I saw a threat. That says something terrible about my own prejudices, and I'm working to change that." The article went viral. The video of Marcus saving Sophie had already been viewed millions of times, but combined with Dorothy's piece, it sparked a national conversation about homelessness, veteran support, and the assumptions people make about those living on the streets. Marcus's phone, a basic smartphone the Whitmores had given him, started ringing constantly. News stations wanted interviews. Talk shows wanted him as a guest. Advocacy groups wanted him to speak at events. It was overwhelming, but the call that mattered most came 3 weeks after the article ran. Marcus was at work, taking his lunch break in the warehouse break room, when his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar California number. "Hello, Dad?" Marcus dropped his sandwich. He hadn't heard that voice in 3 years, not since his daughter Jennifer had told him she couldn't watch him destroy himself anymore and cut off contact. "Jenny," his voice cracked on her name. "Dad, I saw the article. I saw the video. I saw what you did for that little girl." She was crying. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I abandoned you when you needed me most." "No, baby. Don't apologize. You had every right to. I read that you've been homeless for 2 years, Dad." 2 years. "I knew you'd lost your job, but I thought you'd figured something out. I didn't know it had gotten that bad. I should have checked on you. I should have." "Jennifer, listen to me," Marcus said firmly. "You are not responsible for my life. I'm your father. I'm supposed to take care of you, not the other way around. But you were living on the streets. You were cold and hungry," and she couldn't finish, breaking down into sobs. They talked for an hour. Jennifer told him about her life in California, her job as a dental hygienist, her husband who Marcus had never met, the grandson Marcus didn't know he had. Marcus told her about his new job, the apartment he'd just signed a lease for, the way his life was finally coming back together. "I want to see you," Jennifer said. "I want you to meet Alex and your grandson. His name is Michael. He's 2 years old, Dad. You have a grandson." Marcus was crying openly now, not caring that other workers in the break room could see. "I'd love that. I'd love that more than anything. I'm going to book a flight," Jennifer decided. "We'll come visit next month. Or no, you should come here. We have a guest room. You can stay as long as you want. Dad, I want you back in my life." "We want you back in our lives." After they hung up, Marcus sat in that break room and cried until there were no tears left. He'd thought he'd lost her forever, thought that bridge had been burned beyond repair. But here she was, reaching out, offering forgiveness and connection and love. 6 months after saving Sophie Whitmore, Marcus stood in front of a crowd of about 200 people at a Veteran Services fundraiser organized by Catherine Whitmore and her foundation. He wore a suit not expensive, but clean and professional, and looked out at faces that included local politicians, business leaders, veterans advocates, and several homeless veterans who'd been given tickets to attend. "I'm not used to speaking in front of crowds," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I spent 2 years trying to be invisible, so being seen like this is still strange to me. But I'm here because Mrs. Whitmore asked me to share my story, and because I believe stories have power, He told them about his journey, the abbreviated version, hitting the main points without dwelling on the darkest moments. He told them about the night he saved Sophie, about the accusations and the redemption that followed. "Here's what I want you to understand," Marcus said. "That night, dozens of people walked past me. They saw me sitting there in the cold, and they looked away. They didn't see a veteran. They didn't see someone's father or someone's son. They saw a homeless man, and they made assumptions about who I was based on where I was sitting." He paused, looking around the room. "But I want to ask you, what if, instead of assuming the worst about homeless people, we assumed the best? What if we saw veterans who couldn't find work? What if we saw people with mental illness who can't access treatment? What if we saw human beings who deserve dignity and respect regardless of their circumstances?" The room was silent, everyone listening intently. "I was lucky," Marcus continued. "I was in the right place at the right time to help a little girl, and her family was generous enough to give me a second chance. But there are thousands of veterans on the streets right now who haven't had that chance. And they're not there because they're bad people or because they made bad choices. They're there because the system failed them, because we, as a society, failed them." He looked directly at Catherine, who was sitting in the front row with Richard and Sophie. "Mrs. Whitmore's foundation is trying to change that. They're funding housing programs, job training, mental health services, all the things that help people get back on their feet. And I'm asking all of you to support that work, either with donations or with your time or just by changing how you see people like I was." The applause was thunderous. People stood, some wiping tears from their eyes. Marcus stepped down from the podium, and Sophie immediately ran up to hug him. "That was amazing," she said. "You're still my hero, Marcus. You're my hero too, little one," Marcus said. "You saw past what I looked like to who I really was." "Not everyone can do that." Catherine approached, her own eyes red. "Thank you, Marcus. Thank you for sharing your story and for helping us understand how much work we have to do." The foundation raised over $2 million that night. Catherine announced that half would go to building transitional housing specifically for homeless veterans, and the other half would fund job training and placement services. But more than the money, the event changed something in the community. People started paying attention to the homeless population in a new way. Several businesses followed Whitmore Industries' lead and created hiring programs specifically for people experiencing homelessness. The City Council approved new funding for mental health services and addiction treatment. It wasn't a complete solution, but it was a start. 1 year after saving Sophie, Marcus stood in his own apartment, paid for with his own money from his job, and looked around with satisfaction. It wasn't much. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a living room with furniture from IKEA, but it was his. He had a bed that was his own, a refrigerator that was his own, a door with a lock that only he had the key to. On his refrigerator were several photos held up by magnets. One showed him with Jennifer, her husband Alex, and little Michael at Disneyland. They'd gone together last month, Marcus's first real vacation in years. Another showed him with his work crew at the warehouse, all of them smiling after completing a big project ahead of schedule. A third showed him with Sophie at her 8th birthday party, both of them wearing silly party hats. His phone rang. It was Patricia from our Marcus. "I have good news. Mr. Whitmore would like to offer you a promotion. We're expanding our veterans hiring program, and we need someone to run it. Someone who understands what these men and women are going through and can help them transition into employment. The position comes with a raise and full benefits. Are you interested?" Marcus felt tears spring to his eyes for what felt like the 1000th time that year. "Yes," Yes, I'm very interested. Excellent. Can you come in tomorrow to discuss details? After hanging up, Marcus walked to his window and looked out at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere out there, people were sleeping on the streets, sitting in the cold, being ignored or judged or treated as invisible. He'd been one of them. He knew their stories because he'd lived their stories. But now he had a chance to help, to use his own experience to create opportunities for others, to prove that with support and dignity and a real second chance, people could rebuild their lives. He thought about that night in the snow, the moment Sophie had started sliding toward traffic, the split-second decision to run toward danger instead of away from it. He'd been so focused on just surviving, on making it through one more day, that he'd forgotten he was capable of heroism. He'd forgotten he had value beyond his circumstances. Sophie had reminded him. That little girl with her pure heart and her pink hat had seen him not as a homeless man but as a person capable of courage and worthy of gratitude and deserving of a second chance. And now, with his new position, Marcus could help other veterans remember their own worth, could help them see that being homeless didn't define them, that they had value and skills and potential that just needed the right opportunity to shine. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Mom says you got promoted. I told you that you were a hero." Marcus smiled and typed back, "You're the real hero. You taught everyone to see with their hearts instead of their eyes." It was true. Sophie's simple act of recognizing Marcus's humanity had started a chain reaction that changed multiple lives. It had saved Marcus, yes, but it had also changed her parents, inspired a community, and helped countless other people who'd been invisible for too long. As Marcus prepared dinner in his own kitchen, using his own dishes, with food he'd bought with his own paycheck, he thought about all the small moments that had led to this one. The decision to sit outside that particular mall on that particular night, the instinct to run when Sophie fell, the courage to accept help when it was offered, the willingness to share his story so others might benefit. Life had been cruel to him for a while, but it had also given him chances and people like Sophie and Catherine and Richard and Dorothy and Patricia who'd chosen to see his humanity when it would have been easier to look away. And now it was his turn to pay that forward, to be for other veterans what those people had been for him. A chance, a connection, and a reminder that everyone has worth, everyone has a story, and everyone deserves to be seen. 2 years after that snowy night, Marcus stood in front of a newly opened veterans housing facility, cutting the ribbon at the dedication ceremony. The building, funded by the Whitmore Foundation and several other donors, would provide transitional housing for 50 homeless veterans at a time, along with job training, mental health services, and support services to help them rebuild their lives. The building was named the Sophie Whitmore Veterans Center in honor of the little girl whose compassion had sparked this movement. Sophie herself was there, now 9 years old, standing beside her parents. When the ribbon was cut and everyone applauded, she ran up to Marcus and hugged him. "We did it," she said. "We helped so many people." "No, Sophie," Marcus corrected gently. "You did it. You started all of this by being brave enough to see me as a person when everyone else looked away. Never forget the power of that. Never forget that how we treat people, all people, regardless of their circumstances, matters more than anything else." Sophie nodded seriously. "I won't forget, I promise." As the crowd toured the new facility, Marcus stood for a moment looking at the building that bore Sophie's name. Inside, 50 veterans would sleep warm and safe tonight. They'd have hot meals and clean beds and people who believed in them. They'd have a chance to rebuild, just as he had been given a chance. And it all started because a little girl slipped on ice and a homeless man ran to save her. And in that moment of crisis, everyone learned that heroism looks different than they'd imagined, that worth can't be measured by wealth, and that sometimes the people society has forgotten are the ones with the biggest hearts. Catherine approached him, her own eyes misty. "Marcus, I can't thank you enough, not just for saving Sophie that night, but for opening my eyes to how much work we had to do. You changed our family. You changed me. You changed me too," Marcus said. "You saw past your first reaction and chose to do better. That's what courage really is." Richard joined them, shaking Marcus's hand. The board approved funding for 2 more facilities, one in Detroit, one in Indianapolis. "We're going to get as many veterans off the streets as we can." Marcus felt his heart swell with gratitude and purpose. This was why he'd survived those 2 years on the streets. This was why he'd been in that exact spot on that exact night. Not just to save one little girl, though that alone would have been enough, but to start a movement that would save hundreds more. As the sun set over Chicago, casting golden light over the new building, Marcus thought about all the people who'd helped him get here. Jennifer, who'd forgiven him and welcomed him back into her life. Patricia, who'd given him not just a job but a career. Dorothy, who'd told his story when he couldn't find the words. Catherine and Richard, who'd turned their shame and gratitude into action. And Sophie, the little girl with the big heart who'd never stopped believing he was a hero. But mostly, Marcus thought about all the veterans who would walk through those doors in the days and years to come. Men and women who'd served their country and fallen on hard times. People who deserved dignity and respect and a second chance. People just like he'd been on that cold night when everything changed. People who just needed someone to see them, really see them, and recognize their worth. People who were heroes, even if nobody knew it yet. So let me ask you, when was the last time you really looked at someone society tells you to ignore? Drop a comment sharing a time you chose to see someone's humanity when others looked away, because your story might inspire someone else to do the same today. If this made you think twice about the assumptions you make about people experiencing homelessness, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs the reminder that worth isn't measured by wealth. Subscribe and turn on notifications because next week's story shows what happened when a janitor was fired for helping a student after hours, but he turned out to own the entire university. The principal's face when he found out will shock you. Remember, every person you pass has a story, and sometimes the ones who seem to have nothing are the ones with the most to give.